The Intercollegiate
Psychedelics
Network.
Hey everyone, my name is Jenelle Noell. My topic is Dissociation, Hypervigilance, and Allostatic Overload. How might traumatic recovery be facilitated by addressing these components with supplements in preparation for psychedelic treatment? I'm currently completing my Master of Social Work equivalent at the Graduate School of Social Work and Social Research at Bryn Mawr College. I'll be sharing a bit of my story for context, both at the beginning and throughout the presentation. We're going to talk about allostatic load and its associated effects, the reasoning behind why I chose the supplements that I did, dissociation and what I feel all of this has to do with it, and then closing. My depression, my ADHD, both now understood to be connected to a lack of dopamine resulting from the chronic stress associated with PTSD. Things that didn't really even seem to be connected to PTSD. I don't know, my anxiety, my chronic muscle pain, my rumination, all now understood to be connected to the hypervigilance associated with PTSD. Even my varied experiences on the dissociative spectrum, aspects of my borderline personality, these weren't separate disorders. These are coping mechanisms, especially within the context of complex trauma, often called CPTSD. I had been diagnosed with PTSD, but I wasn't able to connect the dots to understand what made all of these disorders I was being diagnosed with treatment resistant until very recently, when I realized that these diagnoses were more so addressing the different maladaptive coping mechanisms associated with PTSD. And CPTSD isn't in the DSM. I am hoping in the near future that the subtypes of PTSD will be included. But I became so adept at presenting a functioning, apparently normal part to the world so that my dissociative experiences attracted less attention as I navigated daily life. Explaining everything to my doctors regarding my symptoms was very complicated, and the ways my system dissociated to continue presenting as normally as possible was not helping. Finding the discipline of social work really saved my skin. My mind, body, and spirit were constantly on fire. I slept stiffly every night, was lucky, and that sleep came too easily for me that I never truly relaxed. The obsessive thoughts began not long after the nightmares ended, often right before I would open my eyes for the day. Digestive issues were a huge part of my experience. Things like constant tonsillitis, even a string of lymph nodes from the back of my neck up to in front of my ear, just randomly lighting up and being a cause for concern. All of my tests were always normal, and this might sound familiar to a lot of us dealing with PTSD across all of its forms. I realized I wasn't considering the issue from any other perspectives, so I decided to take a break from the constant mentalization and really try working with the fact that I felt this systemic inflammation in my body, and maybe instead of trying to work with my brain, I could try working with my body first, and maybe that would in turn help whatever was going on in my brain. Of course, it's hard to prioritize basic things like drinking water and eating healthily when one's entire system is constantly experiencing a state of emergency. And trauma, especially repeated or sustained trauma, contributes to inflammation that one's entire system is susceptible to being affected by. The inflammation associated with chronic PTSD can even bring on symptoms resembling dementia via a phenomenon called neuroprogression, which is just one of the effects linked with allostatic overload. The trauma needn't be an extreme singular event for it to affect our health drastically either. Allostasis, which is the hypothesis that the endocrine system adapts to accommodate stress, involves our ability to adapt to what may feel like smaller, everyday stressors too, that can accumulate over time, sometimes called little t trauma, as opposed to the big T trauma that's often associated with PTSD. This is just one reason why it's so important for everyone, especially marginalized people, to be able to arm themselves in the fight against the long-term costs of cumulative stress by having equitable access to the related information, affordable holistic healthcare, affordable and healthy food, etc. As I prioritized focusing on trying to address the biological costs of my allostatic overload, I found it easier to do things like exercise, take better care of my needs, relax, think, and implement what I had been learning in therapy while navigating my triggers. Let's walk through some of the research and anecdotes that I feel may have played key roles in breaking down the severity of my symptoms. But first, what exactly is allostatic load? Being that allostasis involves the endocrine system's attempts to balance one's stress, allostatic load denotes the amount of stress that is being carried by an individual's biological systems as a result of that stress accumulation. This study conducted by Stacy N. Doan states, notably, allostatic load theory emphasizes chronic stress exposure as a threat to the system rather than single incidences of acute stress. And allostatic overload is the result of one's endocrine systems no longer being able to effectively mitigate the effects of the stress. The very nature of PTSD is one involving this system overload. As many people understand all too well, PTSD involves the reliving of trauma via symptoms like flashbacks, hypervigilance, being on edge, emotional and behavioral issues, nightmares, etc. It is a disorder that for many, both diagnosed and undiagnosed, is always running in either the background or the foreground of the person having the experience. The book, Treating Psychological Trauma and PTSD, edited by Wilson, Friedman, and Lindy, describes PTSD as an allostatic process in and of itself. The presence of non-habituation, also known as being psychologically stuck, as a maladaptive coping mechanism, is described as the failure of the allostatic system to shut down and restore homeostasis. This raises the person's chances of survival if another traumatic experience were to occur, and it also lowers the system's ability to tolerate stress without experiencing adverse biological effects. Being that recovering from PTSD can take months, years, or even decades, that's a really long time to live with both the cumulative stress of the disorder and the additional stress that comes with trying to function in an environment that is most likely not adequately sensitive to the needs of the person having a neurodivergent experience. According to proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the patterns of allostatic overload affect cardiovascular, inflammatory, neuroendocrine, and cholesterol responses. The cost of allostatic overload is positively correlated with chronic diseases such as diabetes, hypertension, autoimmune disorders, fatty liver disease, comorbid psychological disorders, and the list goes on and on and on. The importance of considering the effects of allostatic load when tackling PTSD within the context of a potential ongoing treatment before or in combination with psychedelic-assisted therapy is well summarized by the following article, Allostasis and Allostatic Load, Implications for Neuropsychopharmacology, published by Bruce S. McEwen. The article states, in anxiety disorders, depressive illness, hostile and aggressive states, substance abuse, And post-traumatic stress disorder, allostatic load takes the form of chemical imbalances as well as perturbations in the diurnal rhythm, and in some cases, atrophy of brain structures. I wanted to quickly plug this graphic here, which lays out a bit of what we know regarding the chemical imbalances involved with PTSD. The associated article, called Emphasizing the Crosstalk Between Inflammatory and Neural Signaling in Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, in the Journal of Neuroimmune Pharmacology, may be a good place to start when doing your own personal reading of the available research on the biology associated with PTSD. When I experienced severe periods of this neurotoxicity and maybe even atrophy, it was incredibly hard for me to describe my experiences in a cohesive manner. This was a cause for concern as I was not able to make much progress in therapy or help others understand what was going on with me. My loved ones began making their own assumptions about the permanence of what was going on. I felt like I was trapped in a glass box that was slowly filling with water. In these moments, escape began to feel impossible. One of the associated chemical imbalances include that of glutamate, a neurotransmitter that helps to regulate mood, memory, and cognition, which can become neurotoxic within the context of lasting post-traumatic stress. Accumulating evidence demonstrates that prolonged stress associated with that of PTSD and allostatic overload can lead to the dysregulation of glutamate levels. A study published by Nishi et al. In psychopharmacology found that their studies participants with full or partial PTSD had significantly higher levels of glutamate than those without PTSD. This overabundance of glutamate has been proposed to trigger inflammatory responses and neurotoxicity that is connected with the findings surrounding the effects of oxidative stress. I decided to dive into research regarding treatment with antioxidants and supplements after accidentally finding that my galantamine supplements, which I used to use for the purposes of lucid dreaming, are also a viable option for the treatment of dementia and Alzheimer's, TBI, and PTSD. These are the supplements I developed an interest in from my personal explorations of the associated research. I tried kefir water to inhibit multiple forms of glutamate involved in the health of my gut and counteract some of these systemic effects associated with the allostatic overload. An enzyme called serrapeptase, sometimes also called serratiopeptidase, to address the heightened inflammatory responses and associated pain across my systems. N-acetylcysteine, also called NAC, for the reasons listed here. Iodine for increased stress protection and recovery. After realizing I was likely iodine deficient and receiving confirmation that my blood levels were quite low, even after I had already begun adding iodine to my diet. I increased my sun exposure to improve my responses to stress and inflammation. Supplements to increase levels of glutathione, such as sublingual liposomal glutathione, which has been shown to aid in regulating glutamate without additional oxidative stress. And L-carnitine to aid in the prevention of further memory loss. So why does all of this matter when considering the presence of dissociation, which is just one particular symptom associated with PTSD? The article from Psychedelic Somatic Institute confirmed what I had already understood to be true regarding the nature of psychedelics and dissociation. We'll return to this article in just a few slides. Dissociation is a phenomenon that occurs when one is disconnected from their emotions and memories as a psychological response. Experiences can be placed on a continuum, such as this one, in which extremely common situations like spacing out and driving are on the lower end, and less commonly discussed experiences, such as the disconnection of personality parts, are on the higher end. From an adaptive standpoint, dissociation is protective in that traumatic memories don't resurface, which is an important factor to consider when working with trauma that is treatment resistant. A common experience of many folks with dissociative barriers in treatment is to report that nothing comes up. Feeling safe enough to explore traumatic memories might be aided by addressing behavioral coping skills that one can access when triggered, calming inflammatory signals and symptoms of hypervigilance, um, helping the client understand their system within the context of the disorder and the dissociative symptoms that they might be experiencing, etc. I was able to better implement the skills I had learned in traditional dialectical behavior therapy, also called DBT therapy, and begin to learn to let go of some of my dissociative coping mechanisms, as the supplements and lifestyle changes I implemented seemed to lower my pain and inflammation, which helped ease my hypervigilance and the aggression that often surfaced when I was triggered unexpectedly. I was able to relax more fully, which made it easier to process my experiences when working my way through uncomfortable emotions associated with my trauma. At some point throughout my journey, the inflammation seemed to have become a large reason that many of my symptoms continued to occur with such severity. I later found that there is evidence of marked improvement for those diagnosed with PTSD when DBT is combined with prolonged exposure therapy. So, to return to the article from Psychedelic Somatic Institute, it is noted here that dissociation can be somewhat effective at blocking some of the therapeutic benefits of treatments involving MDMA and psilocybin for folks who have not yet cracked their barrier of dissociative symptoms. I wonder if these supplements, especially anti-inflammatory supplements, might aid in shortening the amount of sessions necessary to break through one's dissociative barriers by possibly lowering the severity of the hypervigilance experienced by the client. Of course, what worked for me may not work for everyone. I do hope that illustrating my process was useful when considering additional solutions for survivors to further empower themselves. It is very possible that prior psychedelic usage hastened my recovery, even if it was done behind the dissociative wall that stood prior to my attempts with supplements and lifestyle changes. I am interested in the sharing of anecdotes with other folks, especially those with dissociative symptoms, and future research regarding supplemental treatment options to be implemented in combination with psychedelics, as well as any associated interactions. Thank you all for your consideration and open-mindedness. I extend my best wishes to each and every one of us on our healing journeys of any and every kind. Take good care of yourselves, and until next time.